And thank Anna. Like I said, she brings a wealth of experience to this, so it was very nice for her to participate in this. We're going to move on past the RFP stage, basically into the what I call the project startup phase. This is where you're kind of, okay, you have a vendor who just came on board, and y'all are going to start working together. And what are some of the typical things that might happen or should happen to kind of start developing that, that vendor relationship and that vendor partnership and that sense of trust, basically, that's been referred to in the morning session. So, one of the things that I think is always a good idea is to kind of jointly with the vendor kind of define what are the metrics you're going to use to measure their performance. And obviously there are certain metrics that are just inherent in the contract. There are like potentially service level agreements. There are other things basically that are just, they're part of the contract, and that's the agreement. But these are usually more like, okay, well, how are you going to measure whether they're doing a good job of managing risk? How are you going to measure whether they're doing a good job of documenting decisions or documenting and resolving issues or things like that? So you can kind of come up with, it's a nice way to come up with, to the extent possible, objective metrics that kind of set the groundwork for saying, okay, this is how we're going to measure you by. And that way everybody has a very clear, concise, knowledge about it. You can look at like the, one of the easiest things is look at the, most folks are, perhaps in this audience are involved in high criticality projects, and as part of that you have to do a status report, basically, that goes to Department of Technology every month that, identifies several different metrics, basically, and they're all about, missing milestones, missing deliverable dates, missing, schedule variance, cost variance, decisions, issues, basically. So there's some framework to kind of define what these types of metrics are, but it's really something that you can do potentially in partnership, and then they know, and basically, if they're objective, basically, okay, when it comes up, and if you are doing a balanced scorecard, they kind of know what score they're going to get, because they're going to be looking at these metrics every month, and you can kind of use those as a basis for assessing how well they're performing. So, like I said, it's all part of it also allows them, basically, as part of that, since you've kind of defined these as part of the project startup, they're going to be looking at them, on a very regular basis. And because of that, they're going to be able to spot trends that they know are going to lead them into a bad situation, so they can start proactively addressing those. And I think one of the things is as part of doing these metrics is also to make sure you define the metrics at a lower level than, now we need to do an SPR. There has to be some, if you define, oh yeah, we're going to measure you as long as you're under, 10% of, you're not overrunning your schedule by 10%, well, you don't want that to be a performance metric, because that's the trigger for you to go do an SPR, so you don't want to do that. So you define it basically at a lower level, and that gives you time to take action, basically, when these thresholds get exceeded, or these metrics get exceeded. I think, and I think this was touched on in the morning session as well, is, jointly define key staff and points of contact for, software development lifecycle activities and deliverables. It was kind of touched on about, defining roles and responsibilities as part of the morning session, but, it really does help. And this is not restricted just to, project folks and vendor folks who are working on the project. This is also those subject matter experts you're going to bring in from other departments or other areas. It's also defining points of contact from interface partners that are going to be working with you. It's inclusive of everyone who has to be involved basically in that project, and defining what those key staff and points of contact are. And based on that, you can develop a better communication strategy to make sure, hey, if it affects this business area, we know exactly who we're going to forward this information to, so they can look at it and review it and understand it. And it's, like I said, it's to define a kind of a single, at least if nothing else, a single point of contact who's going to be the focal point for this information. Now, they may have other folks that are disseminating it to within their team or within their organization, but it provides you one place to make sure you always have some way of coordinating any of that communication that goes back and forth basically between the project and the vendor, the interface partner and the project and the end users, the stakeholders and the project, all those different types of communications that go back and forth. And I think the other thing is to define, in a little bit more granularity, your processes for stakeholder management and communication, basically, about how do you want that to go, and how do you want that to work, basically, with you define your key internal and external stakeholders as part of this process. You're defining who they are, you're identifying points of contact for them, but how do you want that communication to flow? Is it always from the project to the stakeholders? Do you want any direct interaction between vendors and stakeholders? How is it that process works, basically, and what's the process for communicating, to those various stakeholders, and really, clarify who's responsible for doing that communication. Is it a state responsibility? Is it, or is it a particular organization within the state? Certainly, if it's end users, there's usually a group within your department that is focused on doing those types of communications, basically. And tailoring that based on what the stakeholder needs are. Some may be fine with getting, kind of an update every month. Some projects you're going to have to do town hall meetings to go out to folks. You're going to have to do lots of other things to get information out there. And it may start off that you need, monthly information provided to them, and then may go, or quarterly, go down to monthly, then go down to weekly, basically, as you get very close to an implementation or something like that. So, and the other thing I think sometimes I see this get missed on some projects is to provide a really good feedback mechanism for those, because communication needs change throughout the course of a project. You really have to understand that and have a vehicle for folks to come back to you and say, is the level of communication we're giving you appropriate? Do you want more? Do you want less? Are you bombarded by 200 emails a day and you're just like, I don't want to talk. I'll have a rule where I auto forward them to my trash box and be done with it. So I think and there are simple survey tools you can use to go out to kind of the broader community to see what the communication needs are out there. And usually I don't see a lot of, anyway, my personal experience is that I haven't seen a lot of use of surveys in different projects, but like I said, there are a few who have done this, and I think it's a valuable and simple exercise to do. Any questions? All right. We'll be dropping something pretty soon. Make sure everybody's awake out there. All right. So I think another thing is and maybe I think probably a lot of folks have done this basically as part of projects. So perhaps I'm reiterating what people already know. But I think part of that project startup is really to kind of define an expansion of those roles and responsibilities, defining what are the regular scheduled meetings that you're going to have. What are those? Is it a weekly project meeting? How does it work? Who are the deliverable? Who are the folks who are going to be reviewing deliverables? Who are the key review participants that you're going to have? And to really see about pairing, to the extent possible, the state reviewers with the vendor managers or the vendor team that's going to be developing the deliverable. Understanding that type of pairing, focusing, state on key deliverable reviews. And I think during the morning session they talked about, kind of a RACI matrix, roles, a roles matrix basically. Or a PASI matrix, but they're called the same thing. It's to define who's responsible for reviewing what, basically, and what their role is. And in some cases, I've seen these things be where every team is involved in reviewing every deliverable, and it's like, So it basically means you get so it really becomes hard to balance that effort just because of the number of deliverables that are out there, and you can't have everybody looking at everything all the time. So it's good to be able to focus to the extent possible and really kind of define who are those key lead reviewers who are going to be participating in that. Those provide logical flow of reports and meetings. what does that mean? And what I'm trying to say is there's a certain sequence of things you update, you know, like, and I'm going to give an example of a project status meeting. Okay, if you have a cycle where you update your project schedule weekly, let's say, and it's always updated on as of Friday. Okay. You don't want to schedule your meeting, your project status meeting, to be on Thursday, basically, because obviously you're going to be looking at something that's a week old. So you have to make sure as you're doing this, you're kind of making sure that the processes that support that meeting are in line with when the meeting is. So the meeting is based on current information, basically, is the only point of that. Another thing that I think is very useful, you know, as part of the initial project startup is you know, they're kind of defining their schedule, or really defining in detail the schedule. And I think it's critical that, you know, not only are vendor staff involved in that, but state folks and project folks are involved in that as well. And to the extent possible to understand, okay, you know, here are the folks we're going to need from the state to support these types of activities. Maybe they're requirements validation sessions, or they're, you know, joint application development sessions, or there are other types of things that are going to be going on through the project lifecycle. And it's important to understand those things. And it gives a, you know, common understanding of constraints and assumptions that might be associated with the schedule. Maybe they're assuming something can be done in a month, and you're like, no, that can't be done in a month because it has to take at least, you know, 60 days or something like that. You know, there are certain types of things that maybe outside of the direct control of the project that things wouldn't work that in that timeline. You know, it also drives, you know, communication between project and vendor staff. You know, and you know, a lot of times you also have vendors come in, they're also defining their initial, or finalizing their initial documents. So they'll be finalizing the project management plan and the communication plan and the, you know, quality assurance plan from a vendor level. But in a lot of projects, the state already has a, you know, project management plan, and they have a governance plan, and they have a communication plan, you know, that's already a template out there. So, you know, it's always nice when you can blend those two things together and you have just an integrated plan. So you have a vendor/state plan where all these PM processes are going using the, you know, same tools that everyone has access to and everybody can use, and are based on the same processes. And it's really just merged together, and it's really one seamless process, regardless of whether you're a vendor or you're on the state side. You know, and just to make sure that the process you're defining, basically, that the tools you're using or the processes you're defining, you know, are accessible to everyone on the project, or everybody who needs to get access to them. You know, it can be challenging sometimes, because if you use, sometimes it's hard when you're using a vendor tool. They only have a certain number of licenses, and folks can't get to it. So then they have to do something else to extract the data and get it to folks to look at. So you have to make sure any of those tools you're using, or any of the processes, are easily accessible by anybody who needs to use them, you know, and are centralized, and basically to some extent allow multiple folks to go in there and look at information, or look at reports, or look at the current status of a risk or an issue or anything else. And that way everybody's working off the same set of information. So basically, one of the things I attempted to do here was to kind of go through the typical project lifecycle phases. And these can be called different things. They don't have to be called this. I just chose this naming structure. And kind of highlight what's the typical vendor stuff that's going on during that phase, and what's the typical state stuff. Now, in some cases, this is maybe different than what you've experienced. It depends on what the contract says and what type of project you're on. So I just kind of went through and kind of highlighted some of these things. So I think one of the things that's going on, you know, during the initial stage of the project is requirements validation. So sometimes they call this requirements decomposition, but basically you're taking the requirements in the RFP, you're bringing in, you know, subject matter experts or business owners or other folks from within the department to kind of look at the requirements and say, yeah, this is, you know, to either further define them or detail them, or see if there's any refinements that are needed to those requirements to further understand what the context is. You know, so obviously the vendors are pretty much facilitating that process and updating, and usually there's what's called a requirements traceability matrix that highlights, you know, requirements were changed or what new requirements were added to further define what the requirements were that were in the RFP. But really the state's role in that is really to, provide those subject matter experts that are going to participate in those sessions, and those can be from either internal to the project or from various other business entities, basically, within the department. Obviously coordinating with other stakeholders to get their involvement if needed in any of those sessions. And then, a review of the requirements traceability matrix to make sure it's accurate. During the design phase, all right, the vendor's going to be obviously doing designs. They're going to be continuing the work of what they did in the requirements. Basically, they're going to be facilitating a review of those designs. And like I said, the state's role again is really usually to coordinate with the stakeholders that are involved in that and to review those design documents, basically, to compare those to what's in the requirements and make sure they're accurate. During the development phase, you're kind of defining software specifications or other types of things. You're developing code from a vendor side. You're doing code reviews, basically, which is something that's they have what's called code peer reviews or code walkthroughs, basically, that happen during this phase or can happen during this phase. And usually the state's role is to support those. So you have to have someone who's technically adequate or technically knowledgeable to be able to support those code reviews and like I said, to work with the stakeholders. So and the only point of this, and you see this keep being repeated, there is a vendor role of facilitation, but there's also an integral state role, and those things have to work together. And that's the point of how that trust gets built over time, and how you develop this vendor relationship and vendor partnership throughout the life cycle of the project. During this time, you might also be doing data conversion or interfaces, developing interfaces, which the vendors are usually developing those specifications. They're running scripts to test conversion processes, or they're running executing integration testing with interface partners. They're doing those types of things. But on the state side, there is obviously the continued coordination with the vendor and the other stakeholders, but there's also there's interagency agreements basically that are usually put in place to support those interfaces. And I don't know if anybody ever done a project with interagency agreements? Okay, all right. I just want to do something to get somebody's hands up. That's the only point of that. But that's an effort that's usually the state does that. They have to coordinate and they have to set those expectations up with the interface partner of this is what your responsibilities are related to this project. And there's also some support for data cleansing. This is one of those things that always seems to be really hard on projects where you have a lot of data conversion to do. And the reason being because even though they're going to be able to automatically extract and transform and load data to the extent possible from one system to another, there's always going to be some fallout. And usually it's a cyclical type thing. So you might start out, you'll run a data conversion and you'll get 85% of the data converts correctly. Then you have to do some data cleansing. Then it gets up to 90, and then it gets 97 and 99, and then you're like, okay, you're ready to complete your data conversion. So, and a lot of that improvement is because there's a lot of folks within the department who are working in the background within their current systems to clean up that data, basically. So there's a lot of effort sometimes on the back end from the state side to be able to support that. And these are all folks who aren't necessarily directly working on the project. They might be in other departments or supporting current systems. So there's a lot of effort that can be associated with that sometimes. And a lot of that effort can be on the state side sometimes.
So where did you put the strategy and the approach for that? Is that a joint development thing?
For which one? For the conversions?
Conversion interfaces.
For the interfaces?
And mapping and all that.
Yeah, oh yeah, like the actual interface specifications and things like that.
Well, I see that over here, but
yeah, I mean, like I said, the interagency agreements. as far as, how those get defined, what are you talking about? Okay.
Not the energy degree. I'm just talking about a general strategic plan for conversion and tactical, how we're going to address the ETL.
Like I think that's one of those things that gets done as part of that project startup, where you really kind of define who's doing what, and part of that who's doing what is really to focus in on this area and kind of say, okay, what vendor are you doing to do this? You're going to be obviously meeting with some of our folks to understand what the current data looks like. Basically, you're going to be defining some scripts that you can use those scripts to take the data out of the old system and move it into the new system, and then, okay, well, what do you expect that? Do you expect that's going to be a clean process? Do you expect it's going to be, what's your expected rate of fallout for that type of data? And what are you going to do to either correct it on your end, because you can revise the process they use to pull the data to allow more data through, but then there's a business partner or a business owner who's going to say, but wait a minute, if the data's not clean to begin with, then we're just converting to a new system. We're just converting bad data, over to a new system, and we really want to clean up the data. So they can do some things to automate. The vendor can do some things to automate that process, but there also has to be that commitment as part of that project startup that, hey, we may have some need here for folks within this department, and that's usually something that has to go up, through kind of executive sponsorship almost, because it's it can be a pretty large commitment. You want to get that buy-in from that other department that says, yeah, we're willing to take on some load of doing this. And the earlier you can define that, the better off you are, because then you give them time to kind of prepare, and then they're ready, and they're like, okay. And, the only thing worse than having to do this is being told too late that you have to do this. So it's like, okay. So the earlier you can set those expectations about what the level of participation needs to be, and jointly agree on those between the state and the vendor, kind of the better off you are. And like I said, by state, I don't just mean just projects, the project folks who are with the state, but the whole organization that's implementing this. So you can kind of, all those other departments that might have to be part of this. Does that answer it?
No, I mean, yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I just had some experience where you can only do so much data cleaning at the source, because you have to keep that legacy system up and running, and it was built over 30 years and built, running. So and the way they have manipulated the data through those 30 years and overlaid this and overlaid that, and didn't clean that. It's like, oh my God. So so you end up having to do a lot of transformation.
Yes.
And then you have to get into a lot of business rules.
Yes.
To get into the transformation, and it becomes very complex. And I found there's been my experiences between the state and the vendor about that transformation issues on that side of it. So I was wondering where you addressed that.
Okay, now see, now I have a better understanding about what your requirement is. Yes, because you're right. Some of these systems have been around for a long time, and they may have been, we used to have, I used to call it legacy squared, but it's basically legacy data from previous legacy system that is now in your current system, basically, that's got imported some time ago and has now just been building over time. And yeah, you're right. Sometimes it's very difficult because the rules have changed midstream, and some of the data might be, current, and some of it might be a little bit different. And you're like, okay, well, how do I manage that? And I think the other thing that goes along with that is and this sometimes you can't do this, but sometimes you can, is really looking at, okay, how do we need to store and retrieve that data? Do we really need all that data converted into an operational system? Or can we take some of that data that maybe we don't look at very much and we convert it to, a data warehouse, or we put it some other way, so it's not really, we don't have to worry about converting it to the operational system, but we still have it so it's available. When people have to go back and do audits, or they have to do investigations, or they have to do other things to actually pull that data. So that's another thing you kind of do, is you kind of say, okay, how much do I really need in this, live production system versus how much can I put somewhere else where I could still get to it, but doesn't require the same level of transformation. Now you're right. Sometimes it just has to be there, and it has to be there because state reg or something else says you got to keep it for 20 years or or something like that. So sometimes it just there's not too much you can do about that. But yeah, there is. But there are also strategies that should be explored at the beginning when you're kind of defining this to see, well, is there a better way of doing it? And that's really where that partnership comes in, because the vendor may say, oh yeah, we can take this and we can do this with it, compress it, and put it someplace else, and you'll still get access to it, but through a different means.
I just asked it because it's one of our key state points of failure.
Okay, I'll probably make a very quick comments. The industry technology right now is so advanced, mature. This is not a problem for public, it's private too. So the new technology is called data virtualization. Traditionally, this type of master data management. How do you fix what you already there? How do you change the data already in the database? That approach was a failed approach, so nobody uses that anymore. Now it's called data virtualization. You don't change anything on your existing data. You use a software to virtualize your data, which you don't access your database anymore. You access the software. The software will package the data, or retrieve the data, do the dynamic cleansing. So you'll get fresh data, whatever you want. So the software will constantly do the change. So they call data virtualization. If that's the challenge you are facing, so you've used Google data virtualization, the whole bunch of company there. Layer 7 is one of the top, and quite a few, they will package the data. So that's how Travelocity, they can trace you. Every time you visit their website, then you click the button one time, then the next time you want to look for something. They have a huge data layer behind to do that conversion and do all the consolidation for you.
Thank you. See, there you go. You got the Chief Technology Officer right
Alien platform. Yeah.
So what you can do
Yeah,
is
virtualization there, that's the key, data virtualization.
so you can do an RFI to see. Just a couple more, and then I'll take a break a little bit, and I'll turn it over to Curtis basically to talk to you about some things. The next one is security, and security is kind of two things. In this case, I just broke it up into there's kind of network security, like intrusion detection type security, penetration testing type of security. But then there's also the role-based security, and almost every project you see, there's certain you're defining roles that certain groups of folks will use to access the system. And it determines whether they have read access or they have read-write access, and which pages they have access to, and all these types of things. And the vendor is, obviously actively defining those things. Personally, I've seen a couple of examples where, even though technically implementing those roles is very simple, there's a lot of design that has to go in that really has to be coordinated with the state folks to understand what those roles should be and how they have to layer on top of each other to give somebody access to the system, and so that can also be one of those things that can require a lot of state involvement, basically. And you also, in some cases, it's quite simple to actually assign the users to the roles once you get those roles defined. In some cases, it might not be as simple, So there is a lot of, and I've seen a couple places where, they have done the security, but it requires a lot of last-minute effort on behalf of the state to kind of map those users and roles together. And that's one of those things that is very nice if you can coordinate as part of kind of that upfront project startup activity, who's involved in this effort and what type of timelines you need to have to really stand it up. Because it's one of those things, like I said, technically not hard, but there's a lot of design and analysis that goes on beforehand and also potentially to map the users to the rules.
Talk about process changes, business process changes there too, because those things force, sometimes they enforce a separation of duties,
Yes.
And we work with small departments and large departments, and small departments, they usually wear many hats for one person, and they don't have the separation of duties, and it is a lot of work.
Yes, yes.
So like I said, this is one of those things that I think sometimes, people don't realize exactly how much state effort there is to do these things.
Another thing too, and I like the way you've itemized these things, but one thing that I found on some of the larger projects is with the progressive planning and schedule development, it's hard to do some of the resourcing up front or get the commitments up front for how much SME time you need, for instance, because you haven't planned your testing phases, for instance. So do you have examples of like somebody who's successfully gained agreements and buy-in, like from the non-project staff, the non-full-time project staff, to assist you without giving them the hours and dates and times that they need?
Yeah, I've seen it done a couple of ways where basically you give them quarters or months, and basically you say, we think, so you kind of feed them information as you get it, and that seems to be more effective basically because you're kind of, you kind of say, okay, we're targeting, first quarter of 2015, and we think we're going to need your help during sometime in this quarter. And as you get closer, and you kind of go through that, progressive planning, and you're looking at, okay, 6 months in advance, I want to detail out my schedule, and as you get up to that process, and you kind of keep, identifying and really looking at those things, and looking at what vendor expertise, then you basically kind of keep updating them on, okay, now we think it's going to be, February of 2015, and we think we're going to need, X number of folks to support that. But and like I said, it's one of those things you develop a partnership with the vendor because in some cases they've implemented the solution several times, so they kind of know, oh, okay, this is about how many test scripts we usually run through. So let's say we're going to run through this many. Expect that if you're doing, let's say UAT, basically, for example, maybe you're going to do 50% of that might be something that a UAT team would do, or comparable number that they might do. So you kind of expand that as you go. But usually, if you get that partnership going, they can help you kind of at least gauge the magnitude of it, and then you can kind of expand that information as you go along. I don't know. Hopefully does that kind of address it?
Yeah, I think it does address it, and I think that the relationship between the vendor and the state staff that are primarily working on the project, that works usually, but where it becomes really challenging is for the state to be able to work with their subject matter experts that aren't necessarily on the project in order to have that trust going, to be able to make your project timelines.
Yeah, and that's part of that kind of communication and escalation, because really, usually that's where you have to get the project sponsors kind of, involved. And some projects, that could help as far as getting that type of commitment. And you usually just have to escalate it up, and you get somebody at the higher level to go talk to somebody else at the higher level, and it kind of rolls down from there. But that's usually one of those things that can be done as part of that communication and escalation process. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. I mean, obviously, as part of getting ready for implementation, you're going to be training folks. Basically, the vendor's going to be doing training materials, and usually the state has a role in kind of coordinating and trying to round everybody up to sign up for the training classes. Basically, is the way I like to put it. Making sure that people are signing up for those training classes that are being done to prepare them for using the system, and obviously monitoring that as part of those kind of like an implementation readiness review or something else to say, what's the status of doing training, and have we trained 50%, 80%, 90% of our staff? Okay, all our staff are trained, and kind of monitoring those types of metrics.
So one quick question.
Go ahead.
Interesting to see you put the conduct fit gap analysis under implementation.
Oh, yes.
That usually comes way before, right?
Yeah, and the reason being, and I'll tell you, let me tell you the reason why I did it. To me, implementation is almost like its own separate track to some extent. Because a lot of times, really, I mean, you think of implementation as being, okay, where, in the last few months we're kind of assessing where we are as far as being able to go live. Okay. But in reality, a lot of the things you have to do from a state side to get prepared for that are really looking at, okay, here's what our as-is is, here's what our to-be is, what are the gaps between them, because then a lot of times you might have some state involvement or some state folks who have to revise procedures that are internal to the state. They may have to do something like that. They may have to revise forms. There may be organizational changes, and those things just take a long time to get into place, and they may have a fairly high commitment of state folks. So once you get that, and that's why I put it here. But I mean, it is something, you're absolutely right. It's something that happens earlier, but to me, it's like it was important to identify that that's really a critical part of that implementation phase. And you're right. It's something that happens much earlier, but it does really feed into this thing just because of the amount of work it takes. If you have a lot of changes to your processes, a lot of changes to how folks are doing their job, it may require a lot of coordination with other departments within your organization or other divisions within your organization to really understand where that is. And then to update those policies or procedures and things like that to get ready for this implementation. So it's almost like a background activity that's going on for a long time before you actually get to go live.
So did you fit your M&O under that same category of the OCM part of it? Is that where I have the M&O transition? Yeah,
the M&O transition. Yeah, to me that's kind of part of doing. Part of doing that M&O is kind of the clinician getting kind of the maintenance and operation documents and doing that transition to the state folks who are going to take over ownership of the system and say, yep, you're ready. Okay. That was the end of part one of our thing. So everybody stand up for a real quick second.